Before we start, I just want to share with you what it means to have a divine inspiration. 30 years ago, I had this compulsion to wander around the campus at Sydney University wearing a sandwich board which had on it, "The embryo is asleep. It's not a nothing brain, it's a sleeping brain." They all thought I was completely mad, but I did hear the voice of one girl behind me who said, "You know, he might be right." 30 years later, here I am with the same compulsion, wandering around Oxford wearing a t-shirt which conveys essentially the same message. If you come away from here tonight I'm going to give you a lot of information here tonight. If you come away from here tonight with the same conviction that I've had these past 30 years, that the embryo is asleep, then no doubt after that you will be having your own intuitions about the significance of that. My name is Bradley York Bartholomew. 30 years ago, I was working as a lawyer in Queensland, Australia, when I had the divine inspiration that Freud's unconscious mind and the Hindu inner self are one and the same thing, and that it's located in the embryo brain region of the brain. This is the part of the brain that's already present in the embryo, and it consists of the hypothalamus, thalamus, midbrain and brainstem. In other words, the inner self is a real substantial part of the brain with certain form and matter. I mention this at the outset because this will become crucial when I get on to the works of Aristotle later in my talk. With this inspiration that the soul, or the self, is located in the embryo brain region, I then went to India to study the Upanishads. The Upanishads have been around for about 2,500 years, and they're notoriously difficult to interpret. But because I already knew what I was looking for, I was able to come up with an original interpretation of the Upanishads with consummate ease. I wrote an article about this entitled "Inner Self Located," which was published in the Indian Philosophical Quarterly of the University of Pune. The article is available online in volume 18 for the year 1991. The point of the article is that there is already sufficient evidence from neurophysiology and electroencephalography to pinpoint the part of the brain that operates during sleep. So all I had to do was review Hindu philosophy as expounded in the Upanishads on the subject of sleep and ask the question whether the part of the brain that operates during sleep is the part of the brain where the self resides. It can be no exaggeration to say that the state of sleep is the very cornerstone of Hinduism. According to Katha Upanishad, this Purusha who keeps awake and goes on creating desirable things even when the senses are asleep is pure, and he is Brahman, and he is called the immortal. All the worlds are fixed in him, none can transcend him. This Purusha is called such because he sleeps in all bodies. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Two states of sleep are distinguished. First, there is the dream consciousness, which is evoked and sustained by the self. This blissful self, revived by the impressions of joy, etc., is perceived in dream. Sankaracaya commentary on Taittiriya Upanishad. That radiant infinite being puts aside the body in dream. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Purusha is the supreme person who manifests himself as the person in the I and in dream. Sankaracaya commentary on Chandogya Upanishad. There is secondly the state of deep sleep. Here the sleeper becomes immersed in existence. He attains his own self. They speak of him as he sleeps because he attains his own self. Chandogya Upanishad. They reach daily in sleep this Brahman which is the goal. Chandogya Upanishad. In deep sleep, Purusha remains unmanifest with his organs fully withdrawn. Sankaracaya. The self is consistently stated to be the agent that causes the transition from the sleeping to the waking state. It hastens back in a reverse way just to that previous state, the waking state. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Just as a large fish swims alternately to both banks of the river, eastern and western, so even this infinite entity moves alternately to both those states, those of dreaming and waking. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Just as the self withdraws in itself all manifestations in sleep, it projects itself in waking through those very same channels through which it withdrew itself in sleep. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. In my article, I provide ample scientific evidence that the part of the brain that operates during sleep is the embryo brain region. Indeed, there are many indications that the embryo in the womb is in a state of sleep. The state of wakefulness comes about after the state of sleep and depends upon the fetus being developed to the point where, at the end of the 6th month, its eyelids actually open. The part of the brain that operates during sleep is the embryo brain region. So the adult sleeper must therefore be taken to have reverted to the primary fetal state, the embryonic state. Mentally, the adult sleeper has returned to the mother's womb. So that article was published in 1991, about 25 years ago. Just recently, I've had another divine inspiration, this time about an Aristotelian first principle. Aristotle lived in ancient Greece 2,300 years ago, and he's widely regarded as being the pioneer of Western philosophy and science. Indeed, he's regarded as being the father of biology, where in his famous work, De Anima, where he discusses the soul, he's regarded by biologists as having anticipated the DNA as the first principle. So the Aristotelian first principle that I came up with is as follows. Biology is the source of consciousness. DNA is the source of biology. Ergo, DNA is the source of consciousness. As soon as I came up with this first principle, I knew that I had hit pay dirt. This first principle is also kosher with the Spinoza-Leibniz principle of sufficient reason. And it is in fact the most profound thought that a human being can ever have. This first principle represents the absolute limit to knowledge, because all knowledge must be produced by conscious beings. It's no use saying that eventually Western science will know all there is to know about how consciousness works, because any such detailed knowledge will have to be produced by conscious scientists and will therefore likewise be subject to the first principle. This is the problem of self-reference, which has already been sorted by the mathematician Gödel, G-O-D-E-L. So I took my Aristotelian first principle to the University of Paris in the Sorbonne, and I challenged the professors to come out and debate with me about this. At the Sorbonne, there is a statue of Montaigne. Montaigne wrote his essays towards the end of the 16th century, and one of the things he said was, "We cannot trust our reasoning. Thoughts just occur to us. We don't fully control them." Then along came Descartes in the first half of the 17th century, and he said, "We cannot trust what we perceive through the senses, because that might be an illusion. But what we can trust is our reasoning. I think, therefore I am." What he actually said was, I've got a clear and distinct idea of the mind as a thinking, non-extended thing. I've got a clear and distinct idea of the body as an extended, non-thinking thing. Therefore the mind is distinct from the body and can exist without it. For the Hindus, our thoughts come from the divine inner self in the embryo brain region. For my first principle, our thoughts come from the divine part of the soul in the DNA and embryo brain region, as per Aristotle. Descartes is regarded as being the father of Western philosophy. So for the past 400 years, Western philosophy has been much ado about nothing. It was all sorted by the Hindus and by Aristotle and by Montaigne, even before Descartes came on the scene. Western philosophy is a complete joke. Aristotle, former pupil of Plato at the Academy, and then himself head of the Lyceum, also in Athens, and regarded as being the world's first university. His point of departure from Plato was this notion that all change is ultimately unreal. And the primary task of the science of nature will be to find an explanation for this change. The Platonic soul had to have form and matter so that his students would have something to study at the Lyceum. Unfortunately, this raised more questions than it answered, and for the past 2,300 years, philosophers and scientists and academics have been arguing about exactly what he meant by this. Generally speaking, he states that there is a close connection between the arrangement and functioning of any living being. But that is a long way from explaining how the soul, which definitely has a divine component, can have form and matter. Another word that he used was substance. The divine soul had to have substance. This, of course, is only perplexing for Occidental philosophers, because it's been known all along in India that the divine inner self does indeed have form and matter. Sankaracharya explains the meaning of the word angusta matra, of the size of the thumb. The lotus of the heart is of the size of the thumb, and as conditioned by the internal organ within the lotus of the heart, the self is of the size of the thumb. The Chandogya Upanishad states, this self of mine in the heart is smaller than the paddy, barley, mustard or shimaka seed, or the kernel of the shimaka seed. This self of mine in the heart is greater than the earth, greater than the interminable space, greater than the heavens, greater than all the worlds. The desire is for knowing the special director of the mind, Anandagiri. Who is that effulgent being who directs the mind and the other organs towards their special objects, and how does he direct? Sankaracharya, commentary on Upanishad. That all-pervasive, pure bodiless, without wound, without sinew, taintless, untouched by sin, omniscient, ruler of the mind, transcendent and self-existent, Upanishad. This special director, this ruler of the mind, has to be the part of the brain that causes the growth and development of the whole brain, namely the embryo brain region. Just as the spider weaves out its web and then draws it back in again, so this jiva comes out to and then comes back to the states of waking and dreaming respectively. Brahma Upanishad. This reference to the self being like a spider which casts out its web and then draws it back again occurs many times in the Upanishads. It's consistent with the self being located in the hridaya, heart, which goes by drawing and giving. This would appear to be an illustration of the way the self, in the embryo brain region, by means of the neurotransmitter noradrenaline, draws the individual into sleep, and by means of the neurotransmitter dopamine, wakes the individual up again. These neurotransmitters emanate in spider web pattern through the network of nerve channels in the brain. And just as the man is about to wake up, they emanate. They proceed to their special functions from the mind itself, like the rays radiating from the sun. Sankaracharya commentary on Prajna Upanishad. That the embryo brain region is the location of the self is consistent with the many references in the Upanishads to the self being the seed, the source, the creator. In the person, indeed, this one first becomes an embryo, Aitareya Upanishad. It is the seed of activity, that is to say, the state of deep sleep. This mental state is called jnanam, knowledge, Sankaracharya. By 5 weeks after fertilization, the embryo cranium is bulging with midbrain that is firing spontaneously. This is the vital force. It's like that which is known as the flash of lightning, and it is as though the eye winked. Kina Upanishad. The vital force enters the womb with the seed and develops into the embryo, and all the limbs, the eyes, the ears, and all the rest manifest themselves subsequently. Shivananda. The embryo brain region consists of the hypothalamus, thalamus, midbrain, and brainstem. These are the specific areas of the brain that are discernible 5 weeks after conception, and as the brain grows and develops, they remain the central core and guiding influence. It's mentioned in passing that the hypothalamus and thalamus comprise an area of the brain known as the diencephalons, which also contains the pineal body. I will be giving you a special significance for the pineal body later in this talk when I get on to the philosophy of Descartes. The hypothalamus is responsible for the states of being asleep and awake which are pivotal in our lives. It is said to organize, when electrically stimulated, total acts of aggression, timidity, mating, and sexual behavior in animals. As to these last mentioned aspects, compare the contents of our dreams and our thoughts, where themes such as these regularly occur. In human terms, we think of hatred, fear, love, and desire. The hypothalamus apparently directs our mental processes from the very beginning and is responsible for all our emotions. The hypothalamus is also responsible for the autonomic nervous system, which directs all the myriad functions in our body over which we have no conscious control. Functions relating to digestion, excretion, circulation, respiration, regulation of body temperature and metabolism, regulation of water content and reproduction. The fact that the hypothalamus remains a relatively small area in the adult brain merely attests to its potency and to the fact that it was performing functions just as complex in the embryo period when it was very small indeed. Hence all the references to the self being of the size of the thumb. The entire embryo brain region in the adult brain is indeed about the size of the thumb. The hypothalamus itself has a rostral caudal extent of about 10 millimeters. Compare the fact that the hypothalamus controls respiration with the passage in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. That which breathes by the breath is thy soul, which is in every living being. It is also known that the fetus in the womb practices breathing movements specifically during REM, dreaming sleep. Another factor indicating the workings of the self in the embryo brain region, the source of respiration and dreams. Now he who, without stopping the respiration, goes upwards, moving about yet unmoving, dispels darkness, he is the self. Maitreya Upanishad. The thalamus has many connections with the higher regions of the brain which determine what will become conscious to us. Fibers from the thalamus connect as well to neurons of the central nervous system, gustatory, auditory, visual, and from the skin, organs of balance, bladder, alimentary canal, muscles and joints. The Upanishads speak precisely about these nerves emanating from the heart. And when the man is fast asleep, when he knows nothing whatsoever, returning in the body with the 72,000 nerves by name Hita, which proceed from the heart to all parts of the body, he sleeps. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. By 5 months of gestation, increased brainwave activity is noted with an onset of activity around the thalamus. This is consistent with the thalamus acting as a mediator or go-between between the embryo brain region and the higher regions of the fetus's brain, which are by now substantially developed. It is also consistent with brainwave patterns in the adult brain, where 10 per second rhythmical brainwaves are considered to constitute a loop between the cortical regions and the thalamus. There are a number of theories as to the precise pathway this loop takes, but the concept of thalamus as go-between is reinforced by Baron Edgar Adrian's observation that rhythmical thalamic activity continues even if substantial areas of the cortex are removed. Indeed, even if the entire cortex is removed. Further reinforcement comes from the theory that the thalamus acts as a pacemaker for rhythmical cortical activity, which suggests that command signals from small thalamic regions are distributed to wide areas of the cortical mantle. The importance of the brainstem is certainly on a par with the other areas of the embryo brain, because a system of projections are in place here by the end of the embryo period, 8 weeks, which determine the growth and development of the higher cortical regions. Generally, the brainstem is concerned with states of arousal, sleeping, waking, relaxation, alertness, vigilance, etc. Sensory input from the receptors does not reach the anatomical substrate of consciousness while we're asleep because of the operation of the brainstem. If the input is urgent, it awakes us. The nerve rising upwards from the heart is their passage for moving, from dreaming to waking. It is like a hair split into 1,000 parts. Numerous nerves of the body called Hita are rooted in the heart. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The self, i.e. the subtle body, is surely in the heart. There are 101 chief nerves. Each of them has 100 divisions. Each branch is divided into 72,000 sub-branches. Among them moves the Jnana, Prajna Upanishad. Neurons or nerve cells are a spherical medium enclosed in a surface membrane which contains a salt solution quite different from the surrounding medium. The composition of this external salt medium is similar to that of an ultrafiltrate of blood. Nerve fibres likewise contain an internal aqueous medium and lie in an external aqueous medium, which again corresponds to an ultrafiltrate of blood. As Chandogya Upanishad states, those that are these nerves of the heart are filled with subtle juices. There are many clues in the Upanishads that the self is located in the embryo brain region in the middle of the brain. For example, often the self is simply described as being located in the middle, having meditated on the self in the middle of the lotus of the heart, like a lamp placed in a vessel of the size of a thumb and of the form of a smokeless flame, the self manifests itself. Pangala Upanishad. All deities worship the adorable one, the seated in the middle, that pushes the prana upwards and pushes the apana inwards, impels the apana inwards. Kata Upanishad. In the middle, between the two parts, there comes into being the divine person, the person with 1,000 eyes, 1,000 feet, 1,000 arms. Subala Upanishad. In the middle, between the two parts, between the two hemispheres of the brain. These would all appear to be allusions to the embryo brain region in the middle of the brain. Therein, thy individual soul establishes himself in the middle of the eyebrows. Pangala Upanishad. It just so happens that this spot in the middle of the eyebrows, the mystical third eye of Shiva, is directly in line with the embryo brain region in the middle of the brain. The fact that the midbrain is connected to the eyes is the clue that it is the source of dreams. Hang on, I just lost myself again. As Maitreya Upanishad says, the person in the eye who abides in the right eye, he is Indra, and his wife abides in the left eye. There is a channel extending from the heart up to the eye and fairly fixed there. That is the channel that serves both of them by being divided into two though but one. It is the eye in the man through which he sees in a dream, Vedic text. The visual pathway runs forwards from the midbrain to the eyes and backwards from the midbrain to the visual cortex at the back of the brain. The visual pathway is indeed divided into two though but one, as Maitreya Upanishad states, in order to serve both eyes. Dreams involve visual image and are therefore inextricably tied up with the invisible pathway. As Sankaracharya states, and then when the man's eyes are plucked out, he cannot perceive blue, yellow, etc. in dream. This would appear to be an allusion to the colour cone receptors in the retinae of the eyes that can produce a colour image in our dreams. It is clear that the dream originates as an electrical impulse in the midbrain, which then runs forwards from the eyes runs forwards to the eyes, where it is converted into a colour image. This is why dreams always involve eye movement, either rapid or non-rapid, and then backwards from the midbrain to the visual cortex, where the image is actually registered. It is therefore understandable that brainwaves during REM, dreaming sleep, desynchronized, are practically identical with those during arousal. The visual pathway comes into operation in both cases. As Krishnananda states, as in dreams, so in waking, as in waking, so in dreams. The midbrain thinks, as it were, and quivers, as it were, for being one with dreams. It goes beyond this waking world. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. This is but the middle part of the self, Chandogya Upanishad. Madhyasanam, sitting in the middle of the lotus of the heart, shining in the intellect as revealed knowledge. Sankaracharya commentary on Katha Upanishad. Abiding in the middle place, man sees both places, this and the place of the other world. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It is submitted that in the midbrain is located the cosmic intelligence, Brahman, and Atman, or the individual self, operates through the hypothalamus, thalamus, and brainstem. The Supreme dwells in blissful fellowship with the individual self in the cave of the human intelligence, Rangara Manuja. There are many references in the Upanishads to this guha, this secret place, this cavity, this cave in the intellect, which is Akasha, space. It is a name given to the Supreme because, like a space, Brahman has no body and is subtle, Radha Krishnan. There is literally a cavity or space associated with the midbrain, the fourth ventricle, a broad, shallow, rhomboid-shaped cavity which extends from the upper cervical spinal cord to the cerebral aqueduct of the midbrain. The fourth state, Turiya, the ether of the heart, and it does arguably resemble the broad leaf of the lotus plant, hence all the references to the lotus of the heart. There are many references in the Upanishads to the self being unborn, this great unborn soul, the one which abides as the individual soul in every living being, the one which abides in the lotus of the heart. In him it sleeps. It is the subduer of all, the ruler of all, the sovereign lord of all beings. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. It's only when we grasp the significance of the sleeping state that we can understand this reference to the self being unborn. From conception onwards, the embryo is asleep, and the adult sleeper reverts precisely to the embryonic state of mind. The self is described as being in the embryo brain region, which preserves its embryonic identity. It is in this sense the self is unborn. The adult sleeper, when he or she goes to sleep, reverts mentally to the mother's womb. The talkers vouch indeed for the birth of this very unborn positive entity. But how can a positive entity that is immortal and unborn undergo mortality, mandukya karika? The self, without being born, appears to be born in various ways. It follows that it is born on account of Maya alone, mandukya karika. As Rig Veda states, it is the controller of the body, the unborn part, which survives death. Aristotle's word eidos, which is translated as form, can mean on the one hand the principle of organisation of a being, and on the other, is generally translated as species, means a subgroup of a genus or kind. Also, Aristotle's word ousia, which is generally translated as substance, can also mean being or essence. And in Aristotle's metaphysics in general, it takes on a much wider meaning than simple substance. Aristotle asserts that forms are substances and that souls are forms, therefore concluding that souls are substances. Once we understand that the soul is located in the embryo brain region, there is no ambiguity here whatsoever. The embryo brain is at once the principle of organisation of a being, as well as defining the species that being belongs to and the substance or essence of that being. In addition, the embryo brain consists of matter in the conventional sense of the word. It is comprised of material. It can be examined and studied. It has certain parts and dimensions and texture. Aristotle describes the substance of the soul as what it was to be that thing of the thing, which conveys the idea of what something was all along going to, destined to become. The first actualization of the soul is the embryo brain when the being is an embryo. But because the second actualization of the soul is the embryo brain region in the developed brain, then the ousia or substance of the soul can only be referred to in the past tense. What it was to be that thing was your own embryo brain when you were an embryo. Your own embryo brain was your first enteleki. The embryo brain region in your brain is your second enteleki. It's just that simple. Aristotle devotes the bulk of his discussion to sensory perception, which is classic Hinduism and can have no meaning other than the soul being located in the embryo brain region. Another function of the soul is phantasia, which is generally translated as imagination. We've seen that the visual pathway runs forwards from the midbrain to the eyes and backwards from the midbrain to the visual cortex at the back of the brain. The midbrain as the source of dream imagery would also be the source of phantasia, especially as Aristotle describes it as an interpretive mental act in connection with perception, as well as a special faculty we possess to produce in our own mind images related to but not identical with that of the sense. The soul is also responsible for the motivative faculty in living beings. We've seen that the hypothalamus organizes total acts of aggression, timidity, mating and sexual behavior in animals. And as for the cause of movement, we need look no further than the motor thalamus, which has extensive afferent connections with the premotor and primary motor cortex. The motor thalamus is Aristotle's unmoved mover and is an adjunct of God as the unmoved first mover. Aristotle also discusses the intellect as an affection of the soul, but here again his account is manifestly open to the charge of attempting too great an assimilation of thinking to perception, especially to seeing. So the operation of the hypothalamus and midbrain can largely account for this as well. As regards Aristotle's notion of the active intellect and passive intellect, Even Aristotle's immediate successor at the Lyceum, Theophrastus, was already interpreting this as a distinction between the mind as actuality and the mind as potentiality. Aristotle argues in Book 9 of Metaphysics that the actuality is prior to the potentiality. This means, among other things, that the potentiality has to be understood in terms of some corresponding actuality. Here, of course, the actuality being the embryo brain. To conclude this part of my talk, it's only when we understand that the divine part of the brain is the part of the brain that operates during sleep, both dreaming and deep sleep, that we can come to a proper interpretation of the Upanishads. By the same token, Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics refers to Endymion as the God in all of us who is permanently asleep. From conception onwards, the embryo is asleep, and the embryo brain region is the part of the brain that operates during sleep. There can be little doubt that the divine inseparable part of the brain is the embryo brain region, whether you want to call it the divine inner self along with the Hindus, or whether you want to call it the psyche or nous along with Aristotle. In the following quote by Aristotle from Generation of Animals, the word origin is synonymous with first principle. There can be no doubt whatsoever where the soul is located. So if there is such a part which must be present in animals, one which has the origin and end of the entire nature, this must come to be first as motive capacity first, while as part of the end it must come to be along with the whole. On account of this, the part having the origin comes to be first, and then following it, the upper trunk. It is for this reason that the parts around the head and eyes of the embryo are largest at the start, while those below the umbilicus, such as the legs, are small. For the lower parts are for the sake of the upper, and are neither part of the end nor generative of it. By 5 weeks after fertilization, your embryo brain region, the embryo cranium, is bulging with midbrain that is firing spontaneously. This is what it was to be, our soul. So we have seen that the Upanishads state that the self is the seed, the source, the creator of consciousness, and that is located in the part of the brain that operates during sleep, both dreaming and deep sleep, and it draws us into sleep and wakes us up again. I just need to deal in a little more depth with Aristotle's metaphysics of sleep and Descartes' pineal gland before I can put all this together. I'm going to suggest to you that from the Upanishads, Aristotle and Descartes, we can come up with a complete explanation of consciousness. Namely, that from the very beginning the embryo is asleep, and this is what the Hindus call the inner self and what Aristotle and Descartes call the soul. The state of wakefulness comes about after the state of sleep and depends upon the fetus being developed to the point where at the end of the 6th month its eyelids actually open. The opening of the eyelids is of course an external factor and is saying nothing about what's going on in the brain to achieve this state of wakefulness. This would be too great a digression for me to go into in any detail, so I'm just going to make the bald statement that our soul is also responsible for our dreaming state, and that our brain is being programmed to achieve the state of wakefulness through our fetal dreams. This is based on the theory of the famous French neurophysiologist Michel Jouvet, that REM, dreaming sleep, is a genetic programming mechanism for the brain. If you want to know more about this, you should Google my article, Fetal Dreams and the Source of Desire. So our complete explanation for consciousness will be that it comes to us out of the waking state and is withdrawn, otherwise, it comes to us out of the sleeping state and is withdrawn from us back into the sleeping state, and that our brain is programmed to achieve consciousness through our fetal dreams. Aristotle calls the soul in the anima that first grade of actuality of a natural organized body. I've already quoted to you his statement in A Generation of Animals that the parts around the head and eyes appear largest in the embryo at the start, and that this is the origin of the being, that is to say, its soul or first actuality. In fact, Aristotle recognizes that sleep comes first in the being and that wakefulness evolves later. He says in De Anima, both sleeping and waking presuppose our soul, and of these, waking corresponds to actual knowing, and sleeping is knowledge possessed but unemployed. Also in De Insomnis, Aristotle refers to those true thoughts which occur during sleep. Compare Sankarachaya's statement. It is the seed of activity, that is to say, the state of deep sleep. This mental state is called jnanam, knowledge. Also in Book 9 of Metaphysics, Aristotle refers to the sleeping state as the soul as potentiality, and the waking state as the soul as actuality. I've already told you that by 5 weeks after fertilization, the embryo cranium is bulging with midbrain that is firing spontaneously. It's true that during those very first 5 weeks, Aristotle believed that only the nutritive soul is present. He did not believe in those very first weeks that the embryo was in a state of sleep per se, but he says, as something resembling sleep, the sort of state plants also are in. Indeed, at this stage, animals are leading the life of a plant. But there cannot be any doubt that he also believed that the true knowledge, or the soul as potentiality, was there as well. Whole articles have been written on Aristotle's metaphysics of sleep. I just want to quote to you something he said in Eudemian Ethics when dealing with the pleasures of the waking state. Nor would we desire to live for the pleasure of sleep either. For what's the difference between slumbering without being awakened from the first day to the last for 1,000 or any number of years and leading a vegetable existence? Anyway, plants seem to lead this sort of life, and so do children too, inasmuch as at their first procreation in the mother, although alive, they stay asleep all the time. For David Hume, our consciousness is just a bundle of different perceptions. He denied the notion of soul or inner self or substance, which gives us a sense of continuity in these perceptions, and thus a notion of personal identity. However, he admits that we do have a notion of personal identity, and it is our memories that enable us to discover, not produce, our personal identity. Through our memories, we are able to raise up images of past perceptions which enable us to see a chain of resemblance in those perceptions, and thus a notion of continuity. He says, had we no memory, we should have no notion of causation, nor consequently of the chain of causes and effects which constitute our person or self. So for Hume, our memories enable us to discover our personal identity. They do not produce our personal identity. And most emphatically, our personal identity is not synonymous with our soul or inner self. It's now known that our long-term memories are stored in the putamen during deep sleep. The putamen is located in the embryo brain region along with the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin during deep sleep. Descartes famously located the soul in the pineal gland, and there is a high probability that the secretion of melatonin from the pineal gland during deep sleep is an unconscious operation of our soul involved in storing our long-term memories in the embryo brain region. I just need to deal with one traditional objection to the notion of soul. If consciousness is the essence of soul, what can we say about sleep? If conscious attributes are essential for the existence of soul, just like physical and spatial attributes are essential for the existence of body, then what's to become of our soul during sleep? For we all believe that during sleep we have periods of dreaming, but there are also a number of periods of unconsciousness. If I myself am a soul, an essentially conscious thing, then how can it be possible for me to live in a state of complete unconsciousness? Here we see just to what extent mainstream scientists have misconstrued this problem of consciousness. The part of the brain that operates during sleep, which I call the embryo brain region, is not only our soul, it is also our unconscious mind. To say that the soul draws us into sleep and then wakes us up again to give us our waking consciousness is merely to say that we have an unconscious mind and a conscious mind, and that our conscious mind is born out of our unconscious mind. In conclusion, I just want to quote to you the conclusion of William James in his Varieties of Religious Experience. Western science has had a scientific and psychological explanation for consciousness, for the unconscious soul, for more than 100 years. James says, the subconscious self is nowadays a well-accredited psychological entity, and in it we have, I believe, exactly the mediating term required. Apart from all religious considerations, there is actually and literally more life in our total soul than we can ever at any time be aware of. What Mr. Myers said in 1892 about the subliminal consciousness is as true today as when it was first written. Each of us is an abiding psychical entity, far more extensive than he is aware, an individuality which can never completely express itself through corporeal manifestation. The self manifests through the organism, but there is always a part of the self unmanifested, and always, as it would seem, a power of organic expression in abeyance or reserve. James goes on, let me then propose as an hypothesis, whatever may be on the farther side, the more with which in religious experience we feel ourselves connected is on its hither side the subconscious continuation of our conscious life. All that I have added to James's hypothesis is I have located the unconscious soul in the embryo brain region, and I have identified the unconscious operations of our soul as those mental processes which occur during sleep, both dreaming and deep sleep. Of course, once we are aware that the hither side of our soul is in the embryo brain region, then the farther side cannot be that far away. Indeed, the farther side can be no further away than our own DNA. Refer back to my Aristotelian first principle. Biology is the source of consciousness. DNA is the source of biology. Ergo, DNA is the source of consciousness. Or the shorter version of that, DNA is consciousness. Having said that, once we know that our consciousness comes out of our sleeping state, then all we can really say about life is we appear to wake up. And when we do wake up, we have consistent memories of having woken up previously. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I'm afraid you can go to the photo. Oh my god. Et Nathalie?